Thanks, everyone. I just want to say before we start, just to give a shout out to Maggie Miller and the whole team at Hilton Humanitarian and in this hotel. Yeah. When you're a speaker, you're really aware of how this works like clockwork. These people are really good at their jobs. So I'm thrilled to be on the stage with these two exciting and incredibly accomplished women. And for personal reasons too, because I spent 30 years of my career in the international sphere, and then I went to work for a media organization covering criminal justice in the United States. And sometimes people say, well, what'd you do that for? China, Saudi Arabia, human rights violations, and then what? And I say, well, criminal justice is the biggest human rights issue in our country. And you know how sometimes your dog looks at you and goes, what? You know, it's like, huh? Really? Never thought of that before. And the question that I want to ask these two women who represent a struggle against racism in the United States and a struggle against racism internationally is how come? How come we think as Americans that civil rights happen here and human rights happen somewhere else? Where did that divide originate from? And what is its effect on both the international movement to combat racism and the domestic one? Do you want to start with that, Tendayi?
Sure, I can start. And I want to say to the organizers, it's really a pleasure to be here on a stage with two really powerful women, and to say generally, it's been really exciting to see so many powerful women occupying the stage at an event like this. I think that question is a really important question to ask, because I think there's a lot to be gained by incorporating a human rights discourse in domestic struggles for social justice and for racial equality. And this gap or this divide has a number of points of origin, and I think one of them actually rests with the government of the United States, which has adopted international human rights obligations, including on racism, but hasn't necessarily taken the steps to make the language of human rights a part of the way we talk about law, the way we talk about policy, and the way that many other countries have done. So I'm always fascinated when I'm traveling to other parts of the world, whether it's Europe, whether it's Africa. The language of human rights is in constitutions, it is in legislation, and people are using it and acting upon it. You come back to the United States and the language of human rights is fairly marginal. And I think cities are doing things a little bit differently, and so Los Angeles is, I think, a city where you see the language of human rights being adopted by mayors. I think social movements are doing a lot to say this is language that is relevant for how we understand our struggles. But it is a very funny thing to see the US on the international stage use the language of human rights, but then the second that you enter the country, that language is diffused. And I have some thoughts on the costs of this, but that's a little bit about the background, I think.
Do you see costs to this divide, Patrisse?
Absolutely. One, I just want to say, hey, everybody. It's good to be here. It's always interesting to be sort of up on a panel and everybody else watching. But I have a lot of gratitude for the Hilton Foundation and for this conversation, especially where we're at right now, living in Los Angeles, where there's 17,000 daily prisoners, where most of those prisoners are there because they cannot afford bail, where we live in a county that is more invested in imprisoning people who have mental illness than getting them treatment. All of these are human rights crises. And if we don't call it that, then we're complicit and really engaging in a conversation that is more to do with this idea that the US has somehow is the enlightened country that has dealt with all the issues. When we first were asked this question about why do we think we don't talk about these issues here inside the US as a human rights crisis, I think it's because it's easy to divorce oneself from an issue. If you use that language, if we were to adopt the idea that it's a human rights crisis, then we have to talk about what that crisis actually is. We have to be honest and transparent about what that looks like. And so I think there are major costs to divorcing ourselves from that language, and it really does impact, I believe, the work that we do, not just at the local level, but how we understand our relationship to what's happening internationally as well.
And do you see, Tendayi, is there a way in which U.S. leadership is weaker because of its lack of understanding of its own human rights issues domestically? Or how does it impact the international level that there is this divide inside the U.S. consciousness?
I think that the divide is really costly. And so there's a funny thing that happens when I travel to other parts of the world, and I think Western Europe is one place where this happens, where the inability to talk about race in Western Europe far, eclipses what we see here in the United States. And so in that way, I look to the US and I think there is a way in which there is a sophisticated conversation around race that needs to grow, of course, but that definitely is doing better than Western Europe. The incapacity or the failure to use the language of human rights, though, makes it harder for social justice activists or race justice activists in the US, I think, to connect with people outside because they're using different frames. And so there's a lot of work that is being done here in the US to understand exactly what racial subordination looks like, but I meet, groups in other parts of the world who are saying, well, we can't really access it. They're using a language that is different from ours. And it's been exciting, actually, to meet people who say, oh, we were collaborating with Black Lives Matter. I met with people who were doing work with you all in the UK, and they were talking about how these transnational collaborations allow for people to work on the similar challenges, with community. So the lack of a shared language, I think, is a really big barrier.
Do you want to say anything about the international dimension of Black Lives Matter? Because I think many people maybe don't realize that the idea has caught fire elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Black people are everywhere, so that's just kind of obvious. And when we started Black Lives Matter, Alicia, Opal, and I, we were very clear that it was absolutely necessary to have an internationalist framework, and that we were uninterested in sort of the navel gazing and a bit of the obsession with the civil rights framework that we were given and that we inherited as Black Americans, and that in fact there is a long history of Black American people in particular that have worked with Black people across the globe to have a shared conversation about the diaspora. And so we leaned into that legacy, into that history, and decided that Black Lives Matter wasn't going to be African American Lives Matter. It was going to be purposeful in the intention to have conversations with people across the globe, and more importantly, take action with people across the globe. So Black Lives Matter is not just a network here inside of the States, but there's a network inside of the United Kingdom, there's a network inside of Canada. Black Lives Matter has a network inside of Brazil. And it's been used, the phrase and the hashtag, in places like South Africa, in places like the Dominican Republic, in places like Australia, to advance the conversation around what's absolutely necessary to get Black people free.
I mean, I have to just pause to congratulate you, because in creating this movement, I just feel so strongly that you have changed the conversation we're having in the United States. You really moved history, and I want to thank you for it. I think the previous panel had a really interesting conversation about a problem of international scope and global dimension that nevertheless is being in some ways most realized and best addressed at the local level. And the mayor was very eloquent about what mayors can do about an issue that is by definition planetary. You're operating, of course, Tendayi, on an international stage. It's the UN conventions that you work with are signed by national governments, and yet sometimes, even on your issues and in your work, local governments can be the biggest engine of change. How have you encountered that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I'm an international lawyer by training, and we think of nation states as the big actors, but in research and in doing human rights work, you realize that cities do have a lot of control in lots of different areas. Even in the context of migration, even though borders are national instruments, as we know, cities can and have taken the lead in breaking away from policies that are punitive where migrants are concerned. here in Los Angeles, you see it in a number of different ways. So as I mentioned, there are some cities that will adopt international treaties that states have refused to sign onto. So the US has not ratified the treaty that prohibits discrimination against women, which is shocking. But the city of Los Angeles has an ordinance in place that is supposed to make that treaty apply to the city of Los Angeles. And so we've been using that at UCLA with my students to try and think about what human rights principles around gender equality should apply in the context of LA County jails, for example, or the prison context. And so there's a way in which actions by cities can really allow for different framings that allow for advocacy. And I want to touch on something that Patrisse said, which is about what is lost when we don't have a human rights frame, and what does it mean to have language that forces people to connect themselves to the situations that they're living with. And I've seen it in the criminal justice context, where I'm astounded at how willing people are to tolerate the profound inhumanity that is the status quo in prisons and jails in this country and in this very county. And I said something positive about the US relative to other parts of the world, but the prison and jail conditions, when I travel to other parts of the world, they look at me and they say, aren't you coming from the US? Like, how can you even say anything about it? And it's true, being in facilities here is just completely different from being in facilities elsewhere. And it's people committing the same crimes. So there's nothing about if they are committing those crimes in the first place, there's nothing about the individuals who are being incarcerated that can justify the differences. And so in that context, I think, and I don't know if you agree, Patrisse, I think the language of human rights might be really powerful for making people less comfortable with things, honestly, that are intolerable. I work on different human rights issues, including things like, genocide, mass displacement, and I have to say it's the criminal justice work that I find the most devastating, because it's not treated as exceptional. It's the status quo. It is the plan to treat people in this way, and it's a very American thing. I have to say it is.
Maybe can you speak a little bit, Patrisse, to the advocacy and activism you're doing here in LA? Because I live in New York, and yesterday the city council voted to shut Rikers, which is kind of an amazing thing, although they're also, yes. They have decided to build other jails to replace it, which has been controversial. But leaving that aside, I have to say, visiting LA, I'm struck by how much is happening in this city. And maybe you could address some of these issues around the decision not to build a jail, the decisions to maybe invest in mental health, the upcoming DA's race. You got a lot on the boil here.
We do, and it's exciting. I think, Tendayi, you're absolutely right. The ways in which we as a culture tolerate what happens to people inside jails and prisons is disturbing. And we all have to collectively come to terms that we created this environment that has allowed for those conditions to thrive, and to challenge ourselves in this moment around what we imagine our world to look like. And so, much of the work we've been doing in Los Angeles over the last 20 years is really changing the way criminal justice is looked at in this county. I grew up here in Los Angeles, born and raised, and both what I say is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and also one of the most terrifying cities. I grew up in the middle of the war on drugs, the war on gangs. Over-policing, over-incarceration was the status quo. The way of policing was aggressive, violent harassment, and this was just how it was. And growing up, visiting people inside county jails was a part of the culture of being Black and poor in this county. And as I obviously became politicized, got older, and realized this is unacceptable. And many of the people in these communities are not just being locked up because they're poor. Many of them are being locked up because they're addicted to drugs, because they have mental illness, and these are issues that should be dealt with as healthcare issues, not criminal issues. And so many of us spent 15 years really challenging and pushing back against what was going to be a $3.5 billion jail plan in this county. 2 new facilities, One would be a women's jail out in Lancaster. If anybody's from here, you know that that is far as hell. Nobody goes to Lancaster, not even the people who live there. And the other would be a replacement of Men's Central Jail. Yes, Men's Central Jail should be knocked down, but none of us believed it needed to be replaced. There's 8 facilities. We don't need to grow the jail construction. What we need to grow is people's access to mental health care, people's access to jobs, to healthy food, to greenery, to park space. And then this year, after 15 years of fighting, I'll spare you all the details, I'll send you news articles instead, we won and stopped a $3.5 billion jail plan in Los Angeles County. And many people will, many people sort of, it was never about the jail facility. It was always about what we're investing in. And so this conversation is more about a conversation about investment. What are we willing to spend? What are we willing to spend our dollars on? And who gets what type of investment? So what we know in Los Angeles for the last 30, 40 years, Black people, poor people, people at the margins have been divested from. But the single thing that has been invested in them is incarceration, is criminalization. And so we are reversing that. And so, yes, we've stopped the jail, super exciting. I cried a bunch, and then I got back up and was like, all right, what's the next fight? Because that's what organizers do. Because the next fight is really, how do we ensure a better future for Angelenos? And how do we create a blueprint so that is not just a local conversation, but a national and international conversation?
Do you want to say a little bit about the ballot initiative for next March?
I can talk about all the things.
Since you have some voters maybe in the room.
Yeah, so if you're from Los Angeles County, there will be a ballot measure. We don't have the letter yet, but maybe it'll be Measure R, hopefully. Right now it's called the Reform LA Jails ballot measure that's going to move the largest dollar amount out of incarceration and into mental health. So Los Angeles County is a 10 million person county, 5 districts, super big. We're really pushing for a decentralized mental health care model where people aren't centralized in one institution or a few institutions. Right now, the crisis of mental health care is that people end up in a psych ER, possibly get a bed, or end up on the streets homeless. Much of the homeless population suffers from mental illness. We just saw a really profound LA Times article about it. New York Times is doing a lot of reporting on the homeless crisis in Los Angeles. So we have an opportunity in March of 2020 to reverse that and to change the trajectory for people with mental illness and their families on the conditions that they're going to be living in. And I'm excited that I both founded that ballot measure and the chair of that ballot measure, and we have lots of folks that are working on it across LA County.
Wonderful, thank you. I wanted to turn for a minute to the issue of immigration. At the Marshall Project, our newsroom also reports on immigration issues. It's really a parallel law enforcement, courts, and detention system, which in some ways mimics our criminal justice system and in some ways is, of course, even more terrible. And Tendayi, you've written beautifully about this and about the problem of the othering of an immigrant and our lack of understanding of our own connection to the people and to the countries from which people come. And I think we were talking earlier about, a lack of media coverage of what's happening in Central America that might drive people to our shores and what has been the American role in the collapse of those societies. Do you want to speak a little bit about that issue?
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's a lot of talk about immigration and about migration, and often that talk is rooted in a sense of crisis, and there's definitely something happening in the world, something different that is affecting many people in ways that, you can understand why that label is being applied. But often the focus is on, there's too many people, they're coming here, there's not going to be enough for us, we're going to consolidate the borders. And to me, that kind of framing, which unfortunately I think our leaders are playing into and sometimes leading as well, is really short-sighted and misses a number of important factors. So one, people have always moved. And when they are moving as a result of crisis, which is what we're seeing now, if that's what we're concerned about, the movement of people is only going to get worse, as we talk about climate change, as the previous panel talked about. And the actual fact of movement itself, I think, shouldn't be treated as the issue. The frameworks that govern the movement and the way we think and talk about the movement, to me, are the biggest challenge. And I'll give you a really concrete example. With Central Americans, when you're in the United States, and even, say, the New York Times is covering the movement of Central Americans to the United States as a crisis. And there was an article earlier this year that did this, again, focused on high numbers, on the bureaucratic difficulties, without pausing to question who it is that's actually approaching our borders, right? These are people who are not strangers to the United States. These are people who, if you speak to them, have a lot of familiarity with the US, with its power, with its corporations, because these people are moving from places where military intervention, economic intervention, corporate presence in Central America right now of US companies is increasing, right? And so the US is implicated in the displacement in ways that I think should make Americans feel not only connected to, but recognize those people who are moving as people who are implicated in decisions we are all making in this country. I think that the challenge that confronts us now is to reimagine a world where we have borders that actually reflect the interconnected lives that we are living, right? So we are interconnected globally. People with money move around the globe in ways that can make them feel like we are in a global society. But many of the people who are bearing the brunt of globalization cannot move and are trapped in places that are places of extraction, right? An extraction that benefits consumption in the parts of the world where there is the sense of we are global citizens and we can move around. So I think the challenge is to reimagine borders, not as open or closed, but as facilitating the interconnection that characterizes the way we live. And I think it's achievable. It just requires shifting the debate away from problematizing people and their movement. And if you think about whose movement is problematized, it's people who are racially and ethnically and religiously specified, right? It's people of color or people of certain religions whose movement is the most contested. And when you look at the data on whose presence is unauthorized, people of all races are unauthorized in many different countries, but it's the unauthorized movement of people of color. And I think this is where the othering thing is also important to highlight. But I remain hopeful because I think if we can reimagine the way that borders work, we are in a better position than continuing to insist that it's about closure, because the ship has sailed on closure. It's not going to happen. And what it would require to keep borders quote unquote secure is brutality. And there's nothing secure about brutality. So again, I think the future has to be in thinking creatively about what borders should be. You see, I could talk about this forever, and I'm going to stop now before I keep you in here on this.
I could listen forever. It's not a problem. Patrisse, can you talk a little bit about how you see the immigration system, in which people have even fewer rights than they do in the criminal justice system, affecting the criminal justice conversation in the United States and bleeding in some ways into it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this conversation really lends itself to a larger conversation, which is about abolition. And while this conversation about abolition has a long legacy, many folks, especially in our movement, are really trying to think about, when we talk about the world we want to live in, what kind of world do we imagine? And so many people during the last several years of the immigrants' rights movement have heard this phrase, abolish ICE. That really comes out of an abolitionist framework that policing, court system, detention centers have actually created way more harm, have had very little effectiveness, and really is from the vestiges of slavery, of chattel slavery. And so this conversation around immigration detention centers, which are just prisons with another name, really is a conversation I believe we should be having as a community here in the US and across the globe around what would it look like to abolish these spaces and places that are less about the space and place, but once again, more about what we're investing in. What are we investing our dreams in? And a few of us have really come up with this kind of question, which is, someone imagined a jail cell. Someone imagined handcuffs. Someone imagined police sirens, and then they came to be. And we have this idea that these infrastructures, one, have always been this way, that they're age old and that they've worked, right? This is kind of the framework. Two, that if we were to get rid of these infrastructures, it would be like the purge, right? And then three, well, if we get rid of these spaces and places, what else? And to me, the number three is the most exciting thing, because it gives us the power to reimagine the ways that we want to be in relationship with one another. Policing, prisons, detention centers, borders, all of these places and spaces are really about one single thing: a serious disconnection from each other as human beings. And so what do we imagine reconnection looking like? And so we have to have a conversation about abolition at the center so that we can have a larger conversation about where we want to be.
I have to say there are a number of, thank you, Liz. There are a number of organizations that have brought people working on criminal justice issues in the United States to European countries to see the way it's done. And I'm very aware of this because about half of them, when they come back, submit op-eds to the Marshall Project about how their minds have been blown about how criminal justice is administered in Germany and in Norway, and how it is essentially considered a process of healing, that someone is broken for one reason or another, and how can we help them to be fixed? How do you see this, Tendayi? Is there a dialogue about criminal justice in other countries that we can help to bring and import to our conversation in the United States? And what do you witness as you travel about how other people have imagined a system that will work differently?
I think it's absolutely true. One of the most interesting things about the work that I do is you realize how imagination and what people think is possible in some ways can be one of the biggest prisons, and this probably ties to the session that was on before. So I'll give you two examples. I was just in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and I visited a maximum security prison there that is probably the one that has, people who are convicted of highest level crimes. And I'll say something. I think sometimes people think, oh, of course they have that in Europe. Their criminals aren't doing the same thing. No, that's not what's happening. When you hear the charges of the people who are in there, it's exactly what you have in mind when you think of a maximum security facility. But the head of the facility, when I spoke with him, was so clearly committed to rehabilitation as the fundamental goal, and that's not to say there aren't any violations taking place, but one felt the difference in the structure of the facility as a result of that commitment. And I've visited, jails here that are supposed to be holding people who haven't even been convicted there, where the fundamental assumption is it's about danger and it's about punishment. And there's just no way that your understanding of the fundamental goal of what you're doing in a place, there's no way that doesn't structure everything that you're doing. I'll give you another interesting example. I traveled to Morocco, and there I talked to people who were working on counterterrorism and counter-extremism work. So people working with people who were participating in extreme, like Islamic extremists, essentially. And they were using Islam itself as a kind of Islam and the human rights framework to structure their counterterrorism and counter-extremism work. And it was phenomenal. It was phenomenal. And they were producing results and changing lives and rehabilitating people who in other parts of the world are being stripped of their citizenship and having all kinds of things happen, as that's the only way to deal with these type of people. So I think failure of imagination, and the kind of failure of imagination that persists even when there are examples in other parts of the world, is really something that we have to be thinking about. And I think a lot about the role of education sometimes in terms of sustaining the lack of imagination. So when I'm teaching in a law school classroom, and I'm glad that you raised abolition, sometimes when you say abolition in many spaces, it's panic. you know, and in law schools it's that way, you say abolition and it's panic. But I think that in addition to abolition being a powerful goal, I think if in law schools and in places where we are training people to do the work of immigration enforcement or prison enforcement, we were training them to think creatively about the kind of world that is achievable, because we see it in other places where there are even fewer resources than we have here. I think we would have different outcomes. I really do.
I just have to say that my daughter is a first-year student at UCLA Law School, and when she heard that I was going to be moderating a panel with Tendayi Achiume, she said, "Mom, that's why I chose this law school, because there's people like her on the faculty." So I'm sure you're molding a lot of young minds, and I hope my kids is among them. I wanted to ask you, Patrisse, about, again, imagination and about the sort of entertainment and media industry, which of course has its kind of headquarters in Los Angeles. I think we are seeing some different depictions of the criminal justice system, of racism in America, in major motion pictures. There are people in this town who have said outright that they're committed to making those kinds of movies. I don't want to over-interpret that as a true change in America, but what do you think the significance of that is?
Well, I think, you know, what we've seen in the last 7 years is much of, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, the women's rights movement, the queer and trans movement, you know, disability rights movement, all of these movements that have really changed the makeup of how we understand what we're doing as a country. And folks inside the Hollywood industry have seen this as an opportunity, you know, to amplify and to have a larger conversation about what's happening. And so I actually became a staff writer on a TV show to talk about what's happening inside of Black Lives Matter, but also to talk about what's happening inside of Los Angeles. So I'm one of the staff writers for Good Trouble, and Good Trouble is a show that's specifically focusing on social justice issues, and they have an entire track that's focusing on Los Angeles and this very same conversation. And I think that's so important because, you know, for young people, we are literally being led by, you know, both millennials, which I come from, but then Gen Zers who are being shaped by these movements. I go and speak at colleges and talk to, you know, folks who are like, I was 12 when Black Lives Matter started, right? Yeah. And imagine what movement started when you were 12. You know, I didn't have a movement to grow up inside of at 12 that was popular, that was being projected back to me. And so I think there's an opportunity inside of Hollywood right now, not just about what's happening on our TV screen, but also what's happening inside the industry itself, to reimagine who's in positions of power, who are the executives who are pushing content and how they're pushing it. And I think there's a type of ownership and responsibility that really comes out of these movement spaces, and it feels really profound.
I hope you're right. There's so much, of course, that hasn't been so good. You know, like for starters, don't believe Law and Order. If you watch Law and Order,
well, don't watch those shows.
Empty your head. Empty your head of everything you understood about the criminal justice system from watching Law and Order. Nobody goes to trial in America. You know, that's just not how things work. And I have to say also that I believe the media bears a substantial responsibility for the crisis of mass incarceration. And there have been decades of fear-mongering coverage of crime that helped to lead the American public to think that they were in immediate and mortal danger from people of color. And that's part of how we got to where we are. One of the terms that we now read in the media and that seems to be at least somewhat on the agenda is reparations. Are reparations owed to African Americans in the United States because of to use the international human rights term, crime against humanity that was perpetrated against them over hundreds of years? Are you encouraged by the appearance of that word in the public dialogue, Patrisse? Is it too soon? Are we ready to have a conversation about that?
Well, I think the conversation about reparations goes back to this conversation I was talking about earlier about investment. And so reparations, I think, is a critical conversation, although I do think that the conversation around reparations should be an international conversation. People on the international stage have been talking about reparations for a very long time, Black people in particular, and have received reparations. And so this idea that reparations is really an African-American conversation, I think we should shift it. And I think I'm excited about the beginnings of it being a popular conversation. I've been inside sort of the movement around reparations since I was 16, 17 years old when I first heard of the term, and worked with different sets of organizations. And every moment is an experiment, I believe, to try to figure out what's going to be best for what has happened to Black folks across the globe. So it's encouraging. I think we can go further. I think we should be having an international conversation about reparations. And in many ways, many of the folks who've led the reparations conversation at the local level, kind of like the elders, that was the conversation. It was, how is it tied to this larger conversation around what's happened across the globe to Black folks?
And how would an international conversation like that take place, Tendayi? How could you imagine such a
So
conversation?
we didn't discuss this before, but my next report to the UN General Assembly, which I'm presenting at the end of this month, is on reparations for racial discrimination, including as they relate to colonialism and slavery. And Patrisse is absolutely right. This is a global issue. This is not only a US issue. It's an issue that affects people all over the world. It affects Black people, it affects people of Asian descent, indigenous peoples. There's many people who are implicated, and of course white people as well. And in preparing that report, a number of things were striking to me, and not striking to me, or I really wanted to emphasize them. One, reparations happen all the time in the usual conduct of legal proceedings in many parts of the world. So there's an exceptionalization of reparations as the kind of remedy that, is completely unheard of, does not happen, and that's just not the case. As a public international lawyer, in public international law, reparations is a remedy for violation. So that's one thing. It happens, it's part of the law. And then even reparations for colonialism and slavery have happened and continue to happen. So this is not a thing that is out there and undoable. But what you see when you study the way that reparations take place is that the very dynamics that characterize sort of the projects of colonialism, which is racial hierarchies in terms of who gets reparations, plays itself out there as well, right? So in doing this work, I was speaking to a researcher in the United Kingdom who was saying that in the UK taxpayers have been paying back reparations to former slave owners, right? So this is not to former enslaved, but to former slave owners, that they had been paying back that debt until 2015, okay? So the idea that reparations do not happen and no one's getting them is completely wrong. And what this suggests is that it is about political will and it's about momentum. And the third and final thing I want to highlight from the report, I think there's a reduction of reparations to this is just about money, right? And of course, there are financial implications to granting reparations, and for some contexts, that's the appropriate remedy. But there are many other forms that reparations take, including structural reform, that are really, really important. So Canada is another country that had reparations for First Nations. And in consultations with Canadian First Nation representatives, they were saying that education and just having an educational system that reflected the experiences of people who were enslaved and colonized was at the top of one of the things they wanted most out of the push for reparations. So reparations affect so many different aspects of life, and they are achievable, they are doable, it's happening, and it's about how we understand our relationships among each other. And I think if there can be a greater willingness to engage with that, there might be progress. And this is from the international perspective, and maybe I'll leave it at that.
Well, in the brief few minutes we have left, I wanted to ask the two panelists if either of them have a recommendation to the audience of what they can do. I'm conscious of how many huge issues are being discussed on this stage today, and how small we sometimes feel vis-a-vis the immensity of the problems that face us. And how can we operationalize, such a terrible word, make real in our own lives some of the issues that we're talking about here? Do you have a message to the people in this room about what they might be able to do?
Message for the people. So if you live in Los Angeles, definitely follow Reform LA Jails. We have 5 months to get this ballot measure out and voted on, and so please follow Reform LA Jails. Justice LA is a big coalition here in Los Angeles that has been on the front line of really changing the way that we look at criminal justice here in this county, and so please check that organization out. Obviously, Dignity and Power Now, the grassroots organization that's been leading that work. And if you're not in Los Angeles and you're across, the country or the world, I would say, don't do things alone. There's this big myth that it takes one hero to get us all out of the mud. That's not how it works. It takes, hundreds, dozens, thousands of people to really move things forward. So join an organization that you feel most compelled to join. One of these issues that are being brought up here today around whether it's climate change or criminal justice reform or ending state violence, I always encourage audiences to join something, be a part of something. Now is the time, especially now in this political moment.
So if you wondered what a conversation about racism was doing at an event that's really gathered to celebrate the work that some people are doing in Greece to welcome and help migrants who are appearing on their shores, I think it is precisely this, the belief in the dignity of every individual, the fundamental and inherent rights of every individual, and the respect that is due to every individual, whether it's under a regime of civil rights in the United States or international human rights. We're bound together by, I think, that same belief, and I'm happy to say that I think everyone in this ballroom is bound together by that same belief. So thank you very much for listening, and please join me in thanking our two panelists.